Margaret Chen had worked as a housekeeper for the Harrison family for nearly 3 years. At 42, she'd learned that the best households were the quiet ones, where she could move through her duties with steady hands and a peaceful heart. The Harrison estate was exactly that kind of place. Mr. Robert Harrison was a software entrepreneur who'd made his fortune in the tech boom of the 90s. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him to raise their son alone. The house felt like a museum sometimes, beautiful but hushed, with afternoon light streaming through tall windows onto Persian rugs and polished wood floors. Young Daniel Harrison was 10 years old, a bright boy with sandy brown hair and an easy smile. He wore dark sunglasses even indoors. Daniel had been born with a degenerative eye condition, and by age 7 he'd lost his sight completely. Margaret had watched Mr. Harrison struggle with this reality, pouring money into specialists and treatments, always hoping for a miracle that never came. The grand piano sat in the music room like a sleeping giant. Mrs. Harrison had been an accomplished pianist, and the instrument remained untouched since her death, a polished monument to happier times. Mr. Harrison couldn't bear to hear it played. The sound, he once told Margaret, brought back too many memories. But Margaret noticed something about Daniel. Whenever she cleaned the music room, the boy would appear in the doorway, his head tilted slightly, listening to the faint creaks of the floorboards, the whisper of her dustcloth across the piano's surface. His fingers would move sometimes as if playing invisible keys in the air. One Thursday afternoon in October, Margaret found Daniel sitting on the piano bench. His small hands rested on the closed lid, and his face held an expression of such longing that it made her chest ache. "Do you like music, Daniel?" she asked softly. The boy startled, then smiled in her direction. "My mom used to play," he said. "Dad told me about it. He said her hands would dance across the keys like butterflies." Margaret set down her cleaning supplies. She'd studied piano as a girl in Taiwan before her family immigrated to America. Those lessons, taught by her grandmother in a tiny apartment above a noodle shop, had been one of her life's great joys. "Would you like to learn?" she asked. Daniel's face brightened, then fell. "Dad won't let anyone touch Mom's piano. He says it's too special." Margaret looked at the magnificent instrument, silent and unused. She thought about waste, about gifts left unopened, about the way grief could lock away beauty instead of sharing it. "What if we were very careful?" she suggested. "What if we practiced only when your father is at work? Just you and me." For 3 months, they kept their secret. Every weekday afternoon, while Mr. Harrison attended meetings downtown, Margaret taught Daniel to play. She started with simple scales, guiding his fingers to the proper positions, teaching him to feel the distance between keys, to trust his other senses. Daniel was a natural. His ears, sharp from years of depending on sound, could detect the slightest variation in tone. Within weeks, he was playing simple melodies. Within 2 months, he'd mastered several classical pieces. Margaret marveled at his progress. "Your mother's gift lives in you," she told him one day, and watched his face glow with pride. They were careful, always careful. Margaret would lock the music room door. Daniel would play softly, and she'd keep watch for the sound of Mr. Harrison's car in the driveway. They became partners in this gentle conspiracy, and Margaret hadn't felt such purpose in years. But secrets, even kind ones, have a way of surfacing. It happened on a Tuesday in January. Mr. Harrison came home early from work, troubled by a business deal that had fallen through. The house was silent as he entered through the side door. Then he heard it, piano music, floating down from the second floor. Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 16 played with surprising skill. He froze in the hallway. His late wife Sarah had loved that piece. She'd played it on their first anniversary, and again at Daniel's christening, her fingers moving with practiced grace. The music stopped. Started again. A woman's voice spoke encouragement. "That's beautiful, Daniel. Feel how the melody rises there? Let your hands follow that feeling." Robert Harrison climbed the stairs slowly, his heart pounding. Through the crack in the music room door, he saw his son at the piano, Margaret standing beside him with one hand resting gently on his shoulder. Daniel's face was transformed, alive with concentration and joy. For several minutes, Robert simply watched. He watched his son's fingers find their way across the keys, watched the way the boy's whole body swayed with the music. watched Margaret's patient guidance and Daniel's eager learning. When the piece ended, Robert pushed open the door. Margaret turned, her face draining of color. "Mr. Harrison, I can explain." Daniel's hands flew off the keys. "Dad, we didn't mean to—" Robert held up his hand. To Margaret's surprise, his eyes were wet with tears. He crossed the room slowly and knelt beside the piano bench, taking his son's hands in his own. "Play it again," he said quietly. "Please, Daniel." "Play it again." So Daniel did, and his father listened with his eyes closed, remembering his wife, remembering the music that had filled this house. When love was young and life seemed simple. When the last notes faded, Robert stood and turned to Margaret. She braced herself for anger, for dismissal, for the consequences of her deception. Instead, Robert extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't. Thank you for giving my son this gift." That evening, Robert made 2 phone calls. The first was to the New England Conservatory, arranging for a renowned piano instructor to evaluate Daniel's abilities. The second was to his attorney, arranging something else entirely. 3 days later, Robert called Margaret into his study. She entered nervously, still uncertain of where she stood. "Margaret," Robert began, "I've been thinking about what you've done for Daniel. You saw potential in him that I'd missed. You gave him something precious, not just piano lessons, but confidence, hope, a connection to his mother he never had before." He slid a folder across his desk. "I'm grateful, and I want to show that gratitude properly. Inside, you'll find a new employment contract. Your salary is tripled. But more importantly, your title has changed. You're no longer our housekeeper. You're Daniel's music tutor and companion." Margaret stared at him, unable to speak. "That's not all," Robert continued. "I've also arranged for you to receive a grant to continue your own musical education, if you wish. Sarah always believed music should be shared, passed from teacher to student, generation to generation. I'd forgotten that. You helped me remember." Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," he replied. "Say you'll keep teaching my son. Say you'll help fill this house with music again." Margaret nodded, unable to find words big enough for what she felt. The change in the Harrison household was remarkable. The music room, once a shrine to grief, became a place of daily practice and joy. Daniel flourished under professional instruction. But Margaret remained his beloved first teacher, the one who'd believed in him when others saw only limitation. Robert had the piano tuned regularly. He began attending Daniel's practice sessions, listening from a comfortable chair in the corner, sometimes with his eyes closed, sometimes watching his son's hands dance across the keys like butterflies, just as Sarah's once had. 2 years later, when Daniel performed at a youth concert hall downtown, the auditorium was packed. He played Mozart, Chopin, and Beethoven with skill beyond his years. In the front row sat his proud father. Beside Robert sat Margaret, dressed in her finest clothes, beaming like the sun. After the performance, as the audience rose for a standing ovation, Robert leaned close to Margaret. "You know," he said over the applause, "I almost fired you that day." Margaret laughed. "I know. I'm glad I didn't." "So am I." On stage, Daniel stood and bowed, his face radiant. He couldn't see the crowd, but he could hear their appreciation, could feel the love flowing toward him like a warm tide. He thought of his mother, whom he'd never really known, and of Margaret, who'd shown him that blindness was no barrier to beauty. As they drove home that evening, Daniel in the back seat, exhausted and happy, Robert caught Margaret's eye in the rearview mirror. "You changed our lives," he said simply. Margaret shook her head. "Music changed your lives. I just opened a door." "Sometimes," Robert replied. "That's the most important thing anyone can do." The Harrison house was never silent again. Music flowed from its windows like light, a daily reminder that kindness, offered quietly in small moments, can transform everything. That gifts given freely multiply beyond measure. That sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in protecting what we've lost, but in sharing it with those who need it most. And every afternoon, as Margaret sat beside Daniel at the piano, guiding his hands, encouraging his heart, she remembered her grandmother's words from long ago. Music is the language of connection. When we teach it to others, we give them a way to speak to the world. She had given Daniel that language, and in return he'd given her purpose, reminded her that her own gifts still mattered, that she still had something precious to offer. It was, she often thought, the most beautiful exchange of her life.